Today, we are going to talk about quantitative reviews or quantitative analysis. This is going to be an important concept when practicing evidence based practice because it gives us some insight to be able to evaluate the articles that we read to determine if it is sound and reliable when implementing it into new practices in nursing. So, to start off, what is quantitative research? Quantitative research is any type of research that measures a correlation or a phenomenon through numeric values. So, it's looking at things that we can physically measure and compare measurements either pre or post um, intervention or through sampling others. So, there are two types of quantitative research. There is the survey design and the experimental design. Today, we're going to talk through each of the different designs and talk about different things that should be included in a study that is portraying that specific design of quantitative data. So, when we look at a survey design, we note that it typically assesses trends, attitudes of individuals, and opinions, as well as associations between different things. This is one way to address research questions that are related to descriptive correlations. So, looking at how one factor might impact another factor, looking at the relationship between different variables, and it can also be used as a predictive relationship and correlation. Typically, we'll do a survey design through gathering opinion and information from designated populations. In the experimental design, we're also looking at things like trends and associations, and we're addressing research questions related to correlations as well as relationships between both independent and dependent variables. One of the main differences between the survey design and the experimental design is that in the experimental design, we typically manipulate one or more variables to measure the impact that the independent variable will have on the dependent variables. And this allows us to determine if there's a possible correlation or not. So, to start off with the quantitative analysis or critique of a survey designed quantitative research study. We're going to look at different things, and I'll break this down piece by piece, but we're going to look at just basic information, the structure of the article. Then we're going to look at the design description, so how they did their study. We're going to look at different things like how did they get their participants? What was their sample size? How is their population appropriate for this study? Then we'll look at the survey instruments that could be used and how we analyze whether or not that was an appropriate instrument in the study. We look at if the article portrays a result analysis and whether or not they discuss those results, and whether we can determine if those results are valid and reliable. So, to start off with basic information, we look for different things that are included in the study, like do the researchers come right out and say what the purpose of their survey is, or what is the purpose of their research? Do they provide enough background information to support why their research question is important? Do they talk about why they chose the survey approach and was that appropriate versus the experimental approach? Do they identify any conflicts of interest in the study? Do they identify any risks to their participants? If there is any risk, did it go through an IRB approval process and did the participants receive informed consent? Typically, we want them to include all of the information on this stuff in order to help us understand if it was a sound and appropriate study. Then we're going to look at the design description. So, part of the design description is looking at how the survey collected data. So, what were their collection points? Was it cross sectional or longitudinal? If it was a cross sectional study, that means that they collected the survey data at one point in time and they use the data based on that one point. This typically is more convenient of a design and it can give us most of the information that we typically need. A longitudinal collection point, however, is when you collect the same data multiple times over a period of time. So, this is usually a lot more time consuming, a lot more financially impacting, but it does give us a better understanding of different relationships, correlation, and reliability of the information that we receive. Another aspect of the research design that would be important for the researchers to include in their article is how the survey was collected. So, did they deliver the survey via mail? Did they call individuals and talk about it over the telephone? Was it an internet survey? And did they conduct in person interviews to gather the information on their data? Then we're going to look at the sample size in the population. When we look at sample size, there's a lot of different ways that we can tell if this is appropriate or not. Typically, when a researcher is determining how many participants they need in the study for it to be generalizable and reliable, they'll do what's called a power analysis. And this power analysis will look at the size of the correlation, type 1 and type 2 error rates, and what the individual's measuring, and it'll determine an appropriate size that they believe will give them enough information so that it can be generalized to the general population and so that that information is reliable in its results. So, when you're doing a research critique, you would want to know, do they talk about the power analysis? Does their sample size seem large enough for them to have generalization and reliability? And if it doesn't, do they discuss why they chose the sample size that they did? The next thing that we would want the researchers to include is their recruitment. So, with their recruitment, did they use random sampling, which means that everyone has an equal chance of being selected for the study? Did they use systematic sampling, which means that people are randomly selected but at an interval? So maybe you survey every fourth person that walks into a room, or you um, survey every fifth house in a line. Um, and then there's convenience sampling, which just basically means that individuals are chosen to participate in the study because of their accessibility or convenience as far as their relation to the individuals doing the study. When we're picking our sample size, we can select individuals at random, but we can also have something what's called clustering. And that means that people that are participating in the study can then refer other individuals that can participate in the study so that you end up getting a larger sample size, but it's not as reliable to that random sample as we would see before. Another thing that we want to look for is, did they stratify their sample size? So basically, what that means is, did they separate the individuals that participated in their survey based on identifying characteristics? Like, did they compare this survey responses in men versus women? Did that impact how they selected their population? And was that strategy appropriate? Next, we're going to look at their survey instruments. So, one major thing that we're going to want to identify is, did the individual researchers use their own instrument in which they created, or did they use a survey that was created by somebody else? Typically, if they select a survey that has been developed by someone else, it tends to be more valid and reliable because it has gone through different testing and it has gone through different degrees of research to confirm that validity and reliability. If the individual is doing the study on a survey that they developed on their own, we would want to know if they've done any pilot testing. And the reason that we would want to know that is because pilot testing can lend some credibility to the validity and reliability of the survey. So, when they talk about the survey instrument that they used, they need to describe the survey. So, what is a survey intended to measure? If they're using someone else's survey, we would want to know if they received permissions to use that survey or not. Sometimes surveys are copyrighted and you have to purchase access to use it, and it can only be used in certain ways. Other survey tools are available for free to the general public and for a variety of different reasons. So, next, we want to look at the validity and the reliability of that survey tool. So, when we look at validity, we're looking to see if it accurately measures what it's intended to measure. Reliability means that it's consistent over time and over groups. So, if I give the survey to one individual at one point in time and then I give it to them at another point in time, it'll typically measure the same thing, and the response to the questions will typically be very similar. The next thing that we want to know is their use of content from the survey. Did they use the full survey, or did they only use specific questions? If they only use specific questions, do they talk about why they did that? And then lastly, we'd want to know how they administrated the survey. So, did they hand it out to people? Did they offer an incentive for completing the survey? Sometimes they'll attach um, like money or other perks and benefits to completing the survey. So, all of those things are going to be important when we're looking at whether or not they use an appropriate survey tool. Then we want to look at how they analyze their results. Typically, we would want a sound article to use some type of software to help analysis of the results. In a survey design, there's a lot of different softwares that they can use, like SPSS, JMP, Minitab, Systat, SAS, Stat, and Stata. And each of those different softwares have different benefits based on the purpose of the study. So, when we look at the software that they use, we want to know, was that an appropriate software to use as far as the benefit that that software lends to understanding the research that's intended. Then we want to look at their statistics analyzed. So, one thing that we're going to want to know is the response rate. How many people did they offer the survey to, and how many individuals returned that survey? Is there any bias in the response, especially when we look at the individuals that returned the survey versus those that didn't? Do they offer a descriptive analysis? Typically, with a survey, we're looking for things like the mean, the standard deviation, and the range. And if they don't provide that, or if they don't have any of that data that they were able to collect, do they talk about why they didn't collect that data? Do they talk about how that missing data impacts the reliability of the study and the outcome of the results? Then we would also want them to look at the reliability and internal consistency, which is called the Cronbach alpha. When we're looking at the consistency, we want to know if they measured it with continuous scores or categorical scores. So continuous scores can be anything on a scale of 1 to 10 or, on some type of timeline numerically. Whereas a categorical score assigns a number based on a specific trait or category. So for example, if you were comparing something between men and women, you might assign all women with the number 1 and all men with the number 2. That's going to be important when we look at the software used because certain software is better at measuring continuous data versus categorical data. And so we when we're looking for whether or not a study was good, we're looking to compare and see if they did all of that measurement appropriately and whether or not they explained it appropriately. Then we're going to look at the results analysis and discussion. So, when they're presenting their results and discussing their results, it's typically recommended that they include some form of a table. So, if they did include a table or a figure, is it clear? Is it informative? And is it correct? Do the researchers talk about how it confirmed or contradicted their hypothesis and why? Do they offer their statistical significance, which is given in a p value? And what that means is how much do we know that the results that they got indicate significance into what they measured? We're also looking at the confidence interval. Some people set confidence intervals at different measurements when they run it through analysis software, but typically we'll recommend a confidence interval of 95%. And what that means is based on the statistical significance that they found, they can have confidence within 95% or 95 out of 100 times that that individual or that result was accurate. We're also going to look to see if they discuss the effect size. And then, did they talk about the different implications of their study? How does it lend um, weight or importance to future studies or future impact in healthcare or whatever they're researching? Do they talk about how their results related to similar results of other studies? Do they identify any gaps in knowledge? And if so, what is the significance of it? And then do they talk about the theoretical and practical consequences? And then lastly, do they identify their limitations to their study? If they identify proper limitations, do they have recommendations for how those limitations can be less impacting in the future or how that may have contributed to their study? And that, in a nutshell, is how we would typically do an analysis of a survey designed quantitative research study. So, next, we're going to move on to the experimental design. A lot of this information is going to be very similar to the survey design with a few differences. So, typically, we are going to look at the basic information. Again, we're going to look at the design description, the sample size and population. We're going to look at the intervention and methods of the experiment. We're also going to look at any internal and external validity threats. And then we're going to look for a result analysis and a discussion. So just like the survey design, the basic information that we want is going to be almost exact. Do they have a purpose of the experiment? Why did they choose the experimental approach? Are there any conflicts of interest? Any risk to the participants? Did they go through IRB approval? Did they get informed consent? Do they provide adequate background information for why they did that? As far as the design description goes, again, we would want to know that collection point. Was it cross-sectional or longitudinal? We would also want to know if it's a blind or a double blind study. So, in a blind study, the participants don't know if they're in the control or the experimental group. So, the experimental group would be the group that receives the treatment, whereas the control group would be the group that does not receive the treatment or the intervention. If it's a double blind study, that means that both the researchers as well as the participants don't know who's receiving the treatment and who's in the control group. And the reason why we would do a blind or double blind study is to reduce certain biases or um, impact in the results of knowing whether you had the treatment or not, or having different placebo effects. Lastly, do they describe the independent and dependent variables that they use? So, an independent variable is what is changed to see how it impacts other factors. So, a dependent variable is the thing that depends on the independent variable, and it's the thing that would change if the independent variable changes. So next we're looking at the sample size and population. Again, we want to assess if the sample size is appropriate. We would want to look at the recruitment strategies. Typically with an experimental design, they'll have inclusion as well as exclusion criteria. So we would want to know why certain individuals were included in the study, why certain individuals were excluded, and whether or not that was appropriate to get the information that they're trying to portray and trying to measure. Then we also want to know how randomization occurred. So true randomization means that anyone can randomly be assigned to either the treatment group or the control group, and everyone has an equal chance of being in either group. Whereas a quasi experimental or a non experimental group is when certain individuals are placed in the treatment group or control group based on certain characteristics or factors. Then we want to look at the intervention and methods. Do they describe the methods in a clear step by step way so that we can fully understand what experiment they did, how they did it, and why? Is the experimental design logical? And is it described in a way that anyone can replicate that experiment if they needed to? Did they accurately and appropriately describe the different instruments they used or the different interventions that they used? Are the interventions reliable and valid? Did they address any threats like internal validity threats, any external validity threats, and any statistical conclusion threats? If they talk about those threats that could have happened, did they offer a solution to how they tried to reduce it? And then, like I mentioned with the background information, is their intervention ethically appropriate, and did they go through IRB approval if it isn't ethical? Next, we want to talk about different ways to reduce those threats to validity. So as I mentioned, there's internal and external threats to validity. And these are the different things that can impact whether or not we were able to accurately measure what we wanted to measure. So there's different types of internal validity threats. And these are threats that can change the internal basis of the study. So time-related effects are things that change the results based on a certain time span having occurred, or individuals going through different time related events. Ways that we can try and reduce the effects of time related threats is to have both the control and experimental group follow the same timeline and try and have the same events happen during that time period. Personal growth and maturation can also impact the outcomes as well. So, again, we would try and separate people into groups where they go through the same maturation process or the same growth process. Another phenomenon that we see is called regression to the mean. And this is when you have individuals that feel strongly one way or another, and then throughout time, they slowly kind of go to that median belief or median experience. So, the way that we can reduce any internal threats from regression to the mean is to try and choose people that are more closely related on certain aspects or certain beliefs from the start. We can also have selection bias where certain individuals are picked in certain ways that can change the results. We can have attrition, which is when individuals drop the study, so we don't have as many individuals to fill that sample size to make it generalizable or reliable. We can have intergroup communication and compensation related issues. So, if people in the control group are talking to people in the treatment group and realizing that maybe one group has more benefit than the other, it can change the way that they respond to certain questions or the way that they participate in the study. So, to reduce any intergroup communication or compensation related threats, we would want to make sure that each group has equal benefit of participating and that we limit any communication between the two groups. We can also have testing bias. So, if someone is participating in a longitudinal study and they're receiving testing frequently over a certain amount of time, they may know what to anticipate in their testing, and it may provide bias to how they respond or react to different situations. So, to try and reduce this, we try to have a longer amount of time in between tests, or we try to change the test slightly so that it gives us a more accurate response of how they feel in that moment. And then there's also different ways that the instrument used can cause a threat to validity, and that's if the instrument changes at all, or if different studies come out to indicate that they don't measure what they measure as well as what we thought it was. Then we have our external threats to validity, and there's not as many external threats as there are internal, but we see similar things. So we still see that time related effect. We can also have threats based on the selection of different treatments. And the way that we can reduce this is um, to try and conduct additional experiments with different groups with different characteristics to make sure that the treatment selection didn't cause any threats to validity in itself. And then also the selection of the setting in which the experiment occurs can cause some threats to validity. So, the way that we can overcome that is to try and do the experiment in different settings to make sure that the setting did not impact the results. And then lastly, we have the result analysis and discussion. So, just like the um, survey design, we're looking for the descriptive statistics. So, in the experimental design, we're looking for frequencies, the mean, and the standard deviation. As far as the inferential statistics go, we're typically looking for the analysis of variance in a categorical design. So, this is measured by those statistics processing programs that I talked about earlier. The analysis of variance that we would want them to report could be things like the ANOVA, the ANCOVA, and the MANOVA. And then they can also give us different statistics based on the factorial design. So when we're analyzing if they use the appropriate statistics, we're looking for if they did these different testing with the results and if they described why they did the tests that they did. And then we have the discussion, which we're looking at different interpretations of the data. Was the data significant? Did they discuss any internal and external influences or threats to the validity? And if they did have those different influences or threats, what did they do to reduce that? Were there any implications that occurred during the study? What did they do to reduce any biases? And did they discuss the limitations of their study? And then lastly, Is the information that they gathered from the study and the results generalizable? Can it contribute to different populations or population as a whole? So, as I mentioned, that's how we're going to critique different quantitative designs. There's quite a bit to a quantitative design, but if you break it down piece by piece, it lends a little bit ease in looking at the different pieces and making sure that the study that was conducted appropriately and analyzed appropriately. And that is how you do a quantitative review.